Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy is rather good, and this excellence begins from the offset. The prologue was essentially scrapped together last minute after undergoing numerous changes, and yet it contains an incredible amount of information without feeling indulgent. It includes what is necessary for the story to be understood, establishes clear stakes and certain important world-building aspects that are fundamental to the setting, and it accomplishes all of this in just 7 minutes.
The length of the prologue was always a little bit of a debate. Once we got to the point that we knew a prologue was going to be in the film, it was the very last stages of post-production. And New Line started to impose rules on us, which they'd never done before. They started to say, well, you can have a prologue, but it's got to be no longer than 2 minutes. And our prologue's actually 7.5 minutes. And in a way, it was one of the biggest fights we ever had with the studio, and it was strange because it was the very last thing that happened before the film was finished. You can't make a prologue like this with all this information in a 2-minute length of time.
This video is going to explore what information the filmmakers chose to communicate and how they communicated it to the audience. I will be comparing the final prologue to an early storyboard version, look at character information, music, visuals, and broadly how Peter Jackson chose to open the greatest trilogy of films ever made.
I think the beginning was probably the hardest thing, both in terms of conceiving it and writing it, and then when we edited the film, it was really difficult.
Before I dig into the masterful storytelling shown in this prologue, I will give a very brief recap as to what actually happens. A narrator, later revealed to be Galadriel, gives us a history of the One Ring. We get a montage of the forging and distribution of the Rings of Power, which were given to the elves, dwarves, and men. We see that Sauron betrayed them and crafted a master ring in secret to control the others. The Freelands fell to Sauron until an alliance of men and elves marched on Mount Doom and battled against Sauron's forces. Things were going pretty well until Sauron showed up with his magic ring, and he battered the piss out of everyone, including King Elendil. Isildur, Elendil's son, subsequently managed to cut the ring from Sauron's finger, Sauron exploded, and he was defeated. Isildur was then corrupted by the ring, and he kept it, and he was later attacked by orcs and killed, and the One Ring was lost in a river.
One eternity later.
A goofy goober by the name of Gollum happened to find the ring, and over the next 500 years, it drove him insane. The ring was then taken from Gollum by Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit from the Shire, and we then come out of the prologue and join present-day Bilbo in the Shire as he writes his book. Peter Jackson treated the Lord of the Rings films as though they were history, not fantasy, and this opening scene depicts the history of that history. Where the book opens with a history lesson about hobbits, the filmmakers decided that whilst that information is important, it would be more appropriate to open the film with the history of the ring itself. The reasons for this are many. On a purely cinematic level, opening with an action scene can help hook the viewer by giving them a glimpse of what they will get later if they stick around.
I always had the idea of doing a big battle in the prologue. I looked at it in the sense of like the opening of a James Bond film where, they always have their prologue with some real balls to the wall kind of action scene. I've always loved that as a concept in film because it, as a device, it plucks you out of the world that you've been in that day. You're now in a cinema in the hands of the filmmakers, and suddenly you're being put into this incredible action sequence. You are given no time to think. You've only just sat down to watch the film, and there's all the stuff going on. And then by the time a prologue like that finishes, you're sort of totally in the hands of the filmmaker.
But more importantly, The Lord of the Rings is a vast and complex story with countless moving parts that need to be implied, if not explained, early on for the story to function. And this prologue strips the story down to its most basic fundamentals. Who is the bad guy, and what is the ring? Sauron is incredibly important to the story despite never appearing outside of flashbacks. He is a looming presence that needs to be felt throughout the trilogy, because if the heroes fail, Sauron takes over the world.
He was the one place that we were going to demonstrate the depth of his power, and if we failed to do that, then he really wasn't going to be very credible for 3 whole movies.
If Sauron was just kind of mentioned a couple of times here and there, then this on its own would not achieve the desired effect, and so depicting him right at the start beating the shit out of the free peoples of Middle-earth means the audience is like, oh okay, well that guy not only wants to take over the world, but he also seems pretty capable of doing so if he has the ring, which means the stakes are very clear. Additionally, the importance of the ring cannot be overstated, and whilst it has many properties, the writers are selective in the prologue, and they only tell us what we need to know. It is as evil as Sauron, it is capable of influencing those around it, it has a mind of its own, and the extended edition also reveals that it turns mortals invisible when they put it on. There are many close-ups of the ring itself, giving it even more of a focus than Sauron. And if anything, the ring is more of an antagonist than Sauron, because the ring is present throughout the trilogy, whilst Sauron would only really become an antagonist if Frodo were to fail to destroy the ring. In the book, Gandalf does give Frodo a brief history lesson on both Sauron and the ring, but this doesn't happen until page 70, after all of the stuff with Bilbo's party. This means that earlier chunk of the book lacks the tension present in the film, and whilst that may work in a book because books have the luxury of being able to take their time, Peter Jackson was not able to make an 8-hour cut of The Fellowship of the Ring, and whilst myself and many others would likely enjoy that 8-hour cut, I do not believe it would make for a better movie had he done so. By moving the history of the ring to the very start of the film, it ensures the viewer has some understanding of the stakes before we get introduced to any of the characters, and crucially, it means we know what the ring is before any of the characters do. This is so much better than directly translating the book because this would have obliterated the pacing and neutered any sense of urgency.
Well, the book is a great book, the story is a great story, the characters are great, but it's unfilmable, and it is unfilmable. If you were to just shoot the book page by page, scene by scene, it would just be a mess.
In the book, we get Bilbo's party, and then Gandalf disappears for over a decade before returning to Bag End. I'll discuss the decision to remove this time jump in a later video, but point being, whilst the pacing of the books is not a problem in and of itself, this pacing would absolutely not translate into film. You can't open the film with Bilbo's party, have him use the ring, have Gandalf be like, aha, that's weird, and then disappear for 12 years before coming back, revealing that this ring is indeed the One Ring, and then waiting for a few more weeks before doing anything about it. This doesn't work if your intention is to build a sense of urgency and threat, which was absolutely Peter Jackson's goal. And this is largely accomplished because he wasn't afraid to make these kinds of changes from the book, which is why everything happens so much faster.
Peter was very specific about what he needed. I need to set up Isildur, I need to set up Narsil, I need to set up the Battle of Dagorlad. We need to introduce Sauron, we want to introduce the immortality of the elves, and we want to track the journey of the ring to being lost.
So now let's consider what information is communicated, how Peter Jackson communicates it to us, and why this is effective. It is important to remember that this prologue is the opening of The Lord of the Rings, and whilst many people would have knowledge of the books prior to watching the films, this was appropriately treated as an introduction to the vast mythos of Tolkien's Middle-earth. There are so many ways Peter Jackson could have opened the film, and there is so much information he could have included here but chose not to. And I don't think it is an exaggeration to say that I can't imagine how this prologue could be improved. So, the first thing we are told is that Sauron forged the Great Rings. He gave 3 to the elves, 7 to the dwarves, and 9 to men. During this 30 seconds or so, we get the baseline information for the 3 races. We are told explicitly that the elves are immortal, and that they are the oldest and wisest of all beings. The elves were, however, deceived by Sauron, which means they were perhaps not quite as wise as Galadriel claims. We later see that elves are skilled in battle and tightly disciplined, using swords, shields, and bows. They can speak the common speech, but they communicate with each other in Elvish. Like all factions in these films, the elves of Middle-earth are visually distinct, which is something I plan to cover in more detail in a later video. Aside from the elves, we are told that the dwarves of Middle-earth are great miners and craftsmen who live in the mountains. That is all we get for the dwarves during the prologue, but I'll get back to them later. We are then told that the race of men is considered weak and easy to corrupt. They want power without caring to understand it and without possessing the will to control it. Particular focus is given to the men and their rings, as Galadriel says,
"And 9, 9 rings were gifted to the race of men.
Which suggests that something very bad is going to happen to these men, although we do not learn what until much later. We get varying amounts of detail for the 3 main races of the setting, but all are shown to be extremely important, at least during this time period, 3,000 years before the main story begins. This can be contrasted with the introduction of hobbits, who are stated to be the most unlikely creatures to be involved in important events, such as the history of the Ring. We get these meticulously framed, almost staged shots of the elves, dwarves, and men receiving their rings, and then later the introduction of hobbits is in the form of a small hairy man digging around in the dirt looking for jewelry, which could not be more of a contrast. Anyway, the Rings of Power themselves are stated to be powerful magical artifacts that allowed the bearer the strength and will to govern each race. How this works is not explained, nor does it need to be, but that all 3 races accepted these rings indicated that they all wanted them for various reasons. Men wanted power, that is made explicit. The reasoning for the elves and dwarves is ambiguous, but it can be assumed that the leaders of both races wanted to use their powers for good and to protect themselves from evil. Again, the specifics of how and why these rings were made, Sauron's deception under the guise of Anatar, are not at all relevant to the story of The Lord of the Rings, and so all of that was wisely kept out of the prologue. The use of maps in these films is crucial to the audience's understanding of time and distance, and right from the start, we see maps during the prologue to help us understand the approximate geography of the setting. Because the maps are only shown briefly, we can't be like, okay, so if you travel west from Rohan, you will pass into Eriador and end up in Harlingen, because information like that is not necessary at this point in the story. The maps are instead used here primarily to show us Mordor, because Mordor is where Sauron's evil is spreading from, Mordor is where Frodo is later told he needs to travel to, and Mordor is where the Battle of the Last Alliance takes place. This is evil land, and this evil is spreading across Middle-earth. We are also shown Mount Doom as the place Sauron forged the One Ring. Mount Doom is in Mordor, and this, of course, ends up being the end point of Frodo's mission. Without these map visuals, during the Council of Elrond, we would be told that Frodo has to destroy the ring by casting it back into Mount Doom from whence it came, and we would be like, oh, okay, cool. Where the hell is Mount Doom?
I have no fucking idea.
During the transition from the prologue into the Shire, we then get essentially a panning shot with a real map that Bilbo owns and has laid out on a table, implying things about his character that I intend to get into in the next video. But this panning shot shows us in a more prolonged manner the geography of Middle-earth. It shows where the Shire is, and approximately how big, or rather how small it is, and where it is located relative to Mordor. This map shot essentially gives us a clear view of the overall setting, and our first glimpse of the various locations the story is going to take place in. Again, this is such a simple shot, but it accomplishes so much, and without this map transitioning us out of the prologue, were we to simply hard cut to Bilbo in the Shire, which is where we have been told is where he lives, we would have no understanding as to where the Shire is in relation to Mordor, the location we just saw in the prologue, nor would we understand how geographically insignificant it is. This establishes the Shire as a secluded haven hidden away from the larger goings-on in Middle-earth, and this is before we get any dialogue expanding on the nature of hobbits, their general behaviors, and their outlook regarding the world at large. Anyway, after Sauron forged the ring, he started taking over the world, and this allows the audience to understand the stakes of the story. Sauron's power is stated to be magical and that he is skilled in deception, but we also get to see his physical power as he effortlessly throws men and elves around like they are disobedient toddlers. This could be seen as a movie trope, turning Sauron the Great Deceiver into an extreme physical threat, but I would argue this works because whilst the filmmakers could no doubt have depicted Sauron's subversion of the Free Peoples in more detail, so as to more accurately convey his personality, this would have taken up valuable screen time, and the point of the prologue is not Sauron's characterization. It is the importance and power of the ring itself. And showing the ring allowing Sauron to take on an army by himself accomplishes this very quickly and effectively. The elves and men then worked together to defeat Sauron, and the only reason he was able to be defeated was due to this cooperation. As the films show us repeatedly, the elves are leaving Middle-earth, and many of them have already left by the time the story starts, which means such an alliance cannot happen again. This means if Sauron gets the ring, he will win, because there will be no one left to stop him other than men, and men are weak, selfish, and vain. Probably the most critical piece of world building we get in this prologue is the nature of the One Ring. The ring is not just a MacGuffin because it serves multiple purposes in the story. It has a personality, and it affects the personalities of all characters it comes into contact with. On a purely mechanical level, we need to understand how the ring relates to Sauron, because the stakes of the trilogy are constructed around preventing Sauron from recovering the ring. We see that Sauron cannot physically exist without the ring, because when the ring is cut from his finger, he seems to explode and his physical body within his armor disappears, and his finger disintegrates when Isildur picks it up. This is obviously reliant on magic, but we were told earlier that he infused the ring with his cruelty, malice, and will to dominate all life, which means integral parts of Sauron are being put into the ring, and so, logically, it makes an amount of sense that when the ring is removed from him, it causes his spirit and his body to split. We are later told that Sauron's spirit lingers, but he can't retake physical form unless he is reunited with the ring, and the prologue shows us pretty clearly what will happen if Sauron regains his physical form. We are also shown that the ring has a will of its own, and we repeatedly hear about what the ring did or did not want. Later, when Gandalf is researching the One Ring, we get a shot that is not present in the prologue of the ring shrinking when Isildur takes it, so as to fit his finger, which may just be a case of a magic ring adjusting its size for its new master, which has a practical purpose. But as we know, the One Ring is treacherous, and so this can be understood as the ring tempting Isildur. It reforms to suit his needs. It is tempting him by saying, "You are my new master, and I am here to serve you." It wants Isildur to believe he is in control. It is also implied in the prologue that the ring was somehow calling the orcs to attack Isildur, or perhaps that it intended to take advantage of this attack by the orcs to get back to Sauron. The extended edition shows us very literally that the ring betrays Isildur and causes his death, because the ring falls off his finger, which leads to the orcs seeing him and him getting pincushioned. Gollum finds the ring through chance, quote-unquote, but this was likely due to the magical influence of the ring itself. It took advantage of a weak-willed creature being close by and lured him to it, and it then waited with Gollum for hundreds of years until it had the opportunity to leave. This is all extremely important because, unlike in a book, in a film adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, you can't have pages and pages of internal monologue from Frodo about how much he is struggling with the psychological and spiritual burden of carrying this evil ring. Frodo has to carry this thing for the duration of the trilogy, and so the filmmakers needed to clearly convey that he is always in danger, not just from Sauron and his agents who want to find him so as to recover the ring, but from the ring actively trying to be found, thus turning it into an antagonist in and of itself. The ring is a relic from a forgotten time. It nearly let Sauron take over the world 3,000 years ago, and this timescale simply cannot be comprehended by the audience or by any of the characters in the film outside of the elves and wizards. The danger this thing poses is unlike anything else in the setting, and the prologue does a fantastic job of setting this up.
What we knew right from the word go was that the ring, as the source of evil, had to be somehow animated to almost become a character in the movie in and of itself. It ends up having personal relationships. It has a relationship with Frodo, has an intense relationship with Gollum, has a powerful relationship with Gandalf and Galadriel.
Another important factor regarding the ring is what it does to you if you give in to its power. Isildur believed he could wield the power of the ring himself, and he died as a direct result. But Gollum never wanted power, and so he was simply driven mad. We are told that the ring ensnared Gollum and consumed him, granting unnaturally long life, which sets expectations for Bilbo and later Frodo. Because one of the first things Gandalf says to Bilbo is, "Holy shit, you do not look 111 years old." This suggests that the ring is keeping its bearer alive for its own ends, and this causes irreparable damage to the bearer. The Gollum sequence also sets up "my precious," which is then referenced when Gandalf argues with Bilbo and tries to convince him to leave the ring behind.
Precious? It's been called that before, but not by you.
Which is an important moment, as this forms Gandalf's realization that the ring is dramatically affecting Bilbo's behavior, and he knows that the exact same thing happened with Gollum. Without any of this exposition about Gollum during the prologue, the later scene with Bilbo becomes far less effective, because the film would simply be telling us Bilbo is losing his fucking mind and Gandalf is worried, rather than us having seen the extent to which the ring will drive you mad. Gollum and Bilbo both messed with the ring's plan. Ideally, the ring would have waited in the river until it was found by someone or something that would be able to get it back to Sauron. The most likely candidate would be a man, given that the ring was lost somewhere along the Anduin, and if a man finds it, then the ring would corrupt them and it would find its way back to Sauron. If an orc found it, then pretty much the same thing would happen. Gollum, however, had no greater ambitions that the ring was able to twist for its own ends. Gollum simply wanted to worship this beautiful piece of jewelry, and this was exacerbated by the ring's magical properties. The ring may well have intended for Gollum to find it, believing that Gollum would be corruptible, and that this would lead it back to Sauron. But the ring had no understanding of what Gollum was or what he would do with it, and this led to the ring being taken into some random cave for 500 years, far away from anyone or anything that could return it to its master. Similarly, when Bilbo took the ring from Gollum, he did not present the ring with any real opportunity. Where men desire power, and such a desire can easily be corrupted by the ring's influence because of how powerful it is, Bilbo and Gollum did not desire power in the slightest, and so the ring was stuck. This, rather amusingly, means that the ring was catastrophically unlucky not once but twice, because it somehow managed to find itself in the hands of two separate hobbits, which is just about the worst place it could end up.
The scenes that have been hardest to translate from the book into the film are actually the exposition scenes, and by that I mean scenes that have to explain a lot of detail about the plot.
In addition to all of the primary information we are explicitly told during the prologue, we also get a load of secondary information as a result of the manner in which the primary information is communicated. The very first thing we hear is Galadriel speaking in Elvish before she translates into English, referred to as the common tongue in universe. This immediately gives the impression that we are delving into another time, another place, and another world. This, plus the slow and repeating fades in and out of a black screen, give the impression that a huge amount of time is passing. This is a long, expansive history that became legend, that became myth, and much of what happened during and prior to the events shown in the prologue became lost to time, as all of those who were involved in these events had died. The general tone of the prologue is pessimistic. We are shown a world that has passed its prime. So much has been lost as a result of battles and war, implying that they had a good thing going, but the good times have been over for 3,000 years as a result of Sauron and the Ring. This isn't something bad that happened a few years ago, as if it were that recent, then there may still be some level of optimism that evil can be defeated. This is something catastrophic that happened 3,000 years ago, and the Free Peoples of Middle-earth have been dealing with the fallout since then. Sauron has changed the very essence of Middle-earth. The elves are able to perceive this change, and this is why they are leaving. Galadriel repeatedly tells us how weak men are. This alliance between elves and men being referred to as the last alliance means that this didn't happen again, and so presumably relations between the men and elves broke down, and we learn that this insanely powerful and dangerous magical relic was simply lying in a river for 2.5 millennia. The men who lost it either didn't care to find it or were unable to, and the ring was assumed to have been swept out to sea. However, this did not mean that Sauron was no longer a threat. It simply meant the threat was delayed. As long as the ring exists, regardless of whether or not it is sitting at the bottom of a river, the potential for it reuniting with Sauron is always present, and given that the ring has a mind of its own, this is going to happen at some point. In addition to the elves, dwarves, and men, the prologue introduces us to the orcs, although it does not give us any explicit information about them other than purely through visuals. They are not yet named as orcs, but we can see that Sauron has tens of thousands of them, and they are very obviously evil. They are an undisciplined rabble with no formation and no coherency. They are just a swarm of evil monsters who want to kill you. The prologue depicts the orcs as a nameless horde clad entirely in black, which contrasts with the golden, yellow, and green of the elves, and shows, literally, a battle between dark and light. The Fellowship of the Ring would have been a very different movie without this prologue. And yet, at multiple times during development, the prologue was changed and even removed entirely.
On any film, it's always the beginning and the end that you really struggle with.
During the process of pickups and sort of revamping film one a bit and re-scripting bits and pieces, they sort of thought, well, what are we going to do about the prologue?
And the prologue, you know, we struggled with it, and it was the last thing we finished.
We went through a number of different iterations of how the movie would start. Originally, there was a prologue in the film, and then there was a decision that maybe the prologue was a slow way to get into the movie, and we didn't need it, and we'd get into the movie with Gandalf arriving at Bag End, and then we thought, well, we'd add Bilbo riding in the den talking about hobbits and starting his book. But we went back to the idea that we should set the story up and that you needed to know the history of Middle-earth, and that a great way to get into the history of Middle-earth was through this prologue.
I loved the prologue. I was so frightened when I heard that they weren't going to do it at one point. I think the prologue has a poetic quality to it that really, I think, is so much in keeping with the spirit of the book. I think everyone was waiting for something a lot closer to a movie trailer, a lot faster, a lot tighter.
Peter Jackson filmed and edited a prologue sequence together and then felt it was redundant and decided to open the film with the concerning Hobbit sequence that we see in the extended edition, which would then open the film in a very similar manner to the book. The logic was that the exposition from the Last Alliance prologue would come out in later conversations with Gandalf, and so they didn't need to drop all of this information on the audience in the opening 5 minutes. After screening this prologue-less version of the film for New Line, the filmmakers were simply told, you must have a prologue. And so Peter Jackson put together what became the final version, which makes this the exceedingly rare instance of studio interference improving the finished film. There is a lot of information that could have been included in this prologue that was not, and I actually have the perfect comparison to make here, rather than speculating on how it could have been different. In the special features, there is an early storyboard prologue sequence with narration that is worse than the finished version by an order of magnitude, so let's explore why that is the case. If you are watching this video, then my guess is that you are very familiar with the finished version of the prologue, but for the purposes of making the comparison, I will strip it down to the absolute basics and bullet point what information we get. The Free Peoples of Middle-earth are the good guys, consisting of elves, dwarves, and men. Sauron is the bad guy, and he has armies of orcs at his disposal. Sauron forged the One Ring in Mount Doom, which is located in Mordor. The elves and men teamed up and defeated Sauron, but the king, who remains unnamed, was killed. Isildur, his son, took the ring and was also killed. After this, we get the Gollum and Bilbo stuff, which isn't relevant for this comparison. This is extremely efficient. We learn who was on each side of the conflict, and we are not bogged down with unnecessary details. We don't waste any time on characterization for people who existed 3,000 years ago and died during the battle, and although this prologue is 7 minutes long, which is quite long for a prologue, it is hyper-focused on the ring. Now I'm going to read to you the voiceover narration from the original storyboard prologue, and you can tell me if you think this would have been better or worse. As you are listening, try to imagine that this is the first experience you have of the world of The Lord of the Rings, and consider whether this would have hooked you or caused you to tune out. The world is changed. The beauty of the elves, the children of Iluvatar, is fading from our world, passing from beyond these lands into legend, into myth, into dream. But it was not always so. In the Age of the Stars were the firstborn awoken, and for many ages following did the High Elves inhabit Middle-earth. Immortal, unchanging, they filled the world with music and light and enchantment, for they were created the fairest and wisest of all beings. There awoke two other races. The dwarves, great miners and craftsmen who delved deep into the earth, working gold and jewels into countless treasures. In the Age of the Sun came men. Many were the bloodlines of this race, some weak and corrupt, some noble and just. Mortal men were still the children of creation. And so it was that evil, jealous of the mighty power of light, brought forth its own servants. Hideous orcs spawned in foul pits of pain and hate. And to command these profane forces was evil's greatest servant, the Maiar spirit Sauron the Dark Lord. Sauron made a stronghold in Mordor and built Barad-dûr the Dark Tower. From there he sought to bring all free peoples under the dominion of his darkness. In fair guise did he persuade the elves of Eregion to forge great rings of power. 3 for the elves, 7 for the dwarf lords, and 9 for the kings of men. And within each ring was wrought much of the strength and will needed to govern each race. But, in secret, Sauron returned to his stronghold of Mordor, and in the fires of the Crack of Doom he forged his own, the one ring to control all others. For power can be held in the smallest of things, and used for the greatest of evils. And so it was at the close of the Second Age, a great battle was fought on the plains of Dagorlad. The last alliance of men and elves drove Sauron's orcs back through the Black Gates into Mordor itself. Aeglos the spear of Gil-galad and Narsil the sword of Elendil held sway, and darkness fled before them. Yet it was a dangerous victory, for on the slopes of Erodruin, the Mountain of Doom, Sauron himself was cornered. Some who were not born to die, whom age and disease could not touch, were slain. Gil-galad was slain, and Elendil fell. And some, born to show wisdom and honor, were corrupted by malice. Cast it into the fire, destroy it. Sauron is dead, why destroy it? While the ring survives, his spirit lives, he will return. Stay away from me. Thus, a third age of Middle-earth began. History became legend, legend became myth. Some things that should not have been forgotten were lost.
When we did early drafts of the script, we attempted to write the prologue. And it became so overstuffed with information and so sort of overburdened with its own enormity that we eventually decided we didn't need one.
This original storyboard version of the prologue is good. The story it is telling is fundamentally the same as the final prologue, which I have already said is virtually perfect, but the weaknesses are in how it tells the same story. It takes over 3 minutes before we get to a character making a decision, which is Sauron deciding to trick everyone and make rings. Everything prior to that is, hello, let me introduce you to the various races and locations of Middle-earth. It is filled with unnecessary details. Some of these details are present in the finished film, but they have been moved elsewhere, and some of these details were simply removed entirely because they are not relevant. Where the finished version opens with the forging of the rings and ends with Bilbo finding the ring, the storyboard prologue opens with essentially the dawn of time and concludes with Isildur's death. After which we would have presumably cut to Bilbo in Bag End, which would have been jarring to say the least. The opening 3 minutes or so detailing essentially the beginning of life on Middle-earth is completely irrelevant. We don't need to know about Iluvatar, the Age of the Stars, the Age of the Sun, Maiar spirits, Barad-dûr, or Eregion, and we certainly don't need to know about any of this in the opening minutes of the film. And if we skip past this and consider the battle and defeat of Sauron, the storyboard prologue still includes buckets of unnecessary information that was wisely removed. Dagorlad, the Black Gates, Gil-galad, and the fucking name of his spear, Mount Doom also being called Erodruin, and all of the mechanical stuff explaining that Sauron's spirit is tied to the ring are absolutely a case of information overload, which means the important stuff would inevitably get lost. This original version of the prologue feels like the writers were trying too hard to ensure that they included everything from the book, and the decision to remove a load of this additional information helps to streamline the film and focus the opening on the ring itself.
Whilst we're changing plot things, we're changing some events, we're changing characters, we're losing characters, while we're doing all the normal stuff that you have to do to adapt a book, we did want to be as accurate as possible into putting his thematic material into the film.
What we did find in the process of writing the prologue, which was really valuable, is you can overload, of course. And one of those things that went into overload in earlier drafts of the prologue was the excessive use of proper names straight from Tolkien, such as naming Narsil, the lance of Gil-galad. In fact, even naming Gil-galad himself. It just was too much information, and it wasn't really until Pete got in there in post that you could feel the weight of just excessive information.
Some of this information is very important, but it is not important right now, such as Sauron's soul being tied to the ring, which is why in the finished film the conversation between Elrond and Isildur is pushed back until the ring arrives in Rivendell. As I have mentioned, Sauron's soul being tied to the ring is implied anyway in the finished version, which means this conversation is not necessary to include as part of the prologue. Similarly, we do not need to know the name of Elendil's sword, even though Narsil is of course very important later. Gil-galad and Elendil are explicitly named in the storyboard prologue, likely because both characters were incredibly important to that part of the story. However, in the finished film version, although we see both characters, Elendil is only named later during discussions regarding Aragorn's lineage, and Gil-galad is simply never named. This makes me wonder, why did the writers not remove Elendil's presence from the film, as they essentially did with Gil-galad? If they were going for clarity and streamlining the story, then it would surely make sense to be like the elves and men teamed up and Isildur defeated Sauron and took the ring without ever mentioning his father. However, had the filmmakers done this, then all references to Aragorn's lineage later in the trilogy would have been as the heir of Isildur, not the heir of Elendil. And as we see in the prologue, Isildur was corrupted by the ring almost immediately, and he tried to use it to save his own skin because he was weak. This would then give the impression that Aragorn has the same weakness as Isildur.
The same blood flows in my veins, same weakness.
By keeping the character of Elendil in the prologue, this allows Aragorn to be referred to as the heir of Elendil.
He knows the heir of Elendil has come forth.
Which doesn't have the same baggage, as Elendil was only shown to be a king who died heroically on the battlefield, which means there is hope that Aragorn can be more like Elendil than like Isildur. Going back to the finished version of the prologue as seen in the film, there are a few parts of the story that are simply not present for one reason or another. It doesn't go into the need to destroy the ring, as that only becomes a part of the story during the Council of Elrond. Until then, Frodo is simply carrying the ring to the elves so that people smarter than him can decide what to do with it. We also learn later that it was not Gollum who found the ring, as the narration tells us, it was Deagol. However, this interaction between Deagol and Smeagol and what actually happened to Smeagol is not at all relevant given the tight focus on the ring itself, and so saving this detail for film 3 was a smart move. The manner in which Bilbo finds the ring is different to what happened in the Hobbit novel and film, but again, this was streamlined for simplicity. The prologue also does not touch on what Bilbo did in between finding the ring and being 110 years old in the Shire when we next see him, and the explanation for why on earth he was in that cave is not a part of the film, and you need to either read or watch The Hobbit for this to be filled in. One omission that feels a bit odd but was necessary given the nature of the story is that we are introduced to the three races, but then the dwarves just kind of don't do anything. In the books, some of the dwarves did participate in the Battle of Dagorlad, but they are not present in the film, nor is there any suggestion that they were. The reason for this could be as simple as it being a limitation of visual effects and costumes. Having two armies of human-sized combatants fighting each other is one thing, but adding in an army of people 2/3 of their size wearing totally different armor that would never be seen anywhere else in the trilogy is quite another. However, my guess is that the dwarves are not mentioned because they would be a distraction from the dynamic between the elves and men, a dynamic which is extremely important throughout the trilogy and is largely exemplified by Elrond, whom we see during the prologue. Changing this to the last alliance between elves, men, and also the dwarves were there as well, and they fought together against Sauron, only for the dwarves to barely have a presence in the subsequent story outside of one character, would detract from the relationship Elrond is shown to have with men in general, specifically Isildur, and by extension Aragorn. I don't think this is a problem at all, and I am glad that the filmmakers did not decide to remove the reference to the dwarves getting 7 rings of power because it isn't strictly necessary for the story, because Sauron corrupting all of the Free Peoples is a crucial part of the world building, and so the prologue being like Sauron gave the dwarves some magic rings and then never mentioning them again, leaves us to fill in the blanks. Overall, the storyboard version is weaker because it has the vibe of a narrator sitting the audience down and giving them a history lesson, whilst the final version has the vibe of Galadriel telling us a story, and the history and world building is incidental. I think the final prologue is a fantastic example of how to do incidental exposition, and how you can deliver important secondary information to the audience without beating them over the head with the names of people and places. Although seeing more of Gil-galad and his spear Aeglos would certainly have been cool for fans of the book, taking the time to explicitly point him out and tell the audience about his spear would have given the impression that Gil-galad and his awesome spear are going to be important later, and yet neither are ever mentioned again, which would make this a narrative waste of time that serves only to clog the audience's brain in the name of fan service. The visuals in the Lord of the Rings trilogy are consistently phenomenal, and there is plenty I have to say about the various practical and digital effects they used, certain editing choices, and I may even mention costumes, because the visual style of these films was hugely influential due to how successful they were. A computer program named Massive was developed by software engineer Stephen Regulus specifically to allow Peter Jackson to depict these massive battles on a scale that had never been seen before, and this piece of software has now become widely used in Hollywood blockbusters.
There's artificial intelligence, which is basically an attempt at emulating the processes of a human mind, but there's also artificial life, which is really more of an inspiration for Massive, which is using natural processes to create lifelike results. In Massive, we try to achieve natural crowd-like behavior, not by controlling a whole crowd, but by creating one agent who will react naturally to his environment. Then when we put thousands of them together, they will give us an emergent crowd behavior that is also natural, without us having to say how the crowd has to behave.
Early on in the process, Peter recognized that one of the challenges to bringing Lord of the Rings to the screen was to create these massive battles. And that meant being able to throw an army of 40,000 people on the screen. He spent his own money doing research and development in a program that would accomplish that in a very sophisticated fashion. Because it was create these massive armies, he nicknamed it Massive Software. Each being on the screen is capable of selecting from a range of actions and reactions. So if they're in battle and someone comes at them and raises a sword, they can raise a shield, they can parry the sword with another sword blow. They know if they get hit 3 times, they're dead, so they fall over and die. So there's this intelligent brain built into each one of those 10,000 people on screen or 40,000 people on screen. It's quite remarkable.
Instead of entirely replacing boots-on-the-ground filmmaking, this digital technology was integrated with large numbers of real actors and careful camera angles to avoid feeling as though we are swapping between a real army and a digital army. One perfect example is this fantastic shot of the orcs first clashing with the elven ranks. The way they achieved this shot was by combining Massive with real actors in costume. The 6 or so ranks closest to the camera are real people, and when I point this out and freeze frame it, you can quite clearly see which elves are real and which are not, but when you watch this in motion, because of the lighting, because of the slope of the ground they are standing on, plus the background motion from the elves swinging their swords, plus the fact that this shot is less than 3 seconds long, none of this feels out of place. There are some shots later in the trilogy, as well as in the Hobbit trilogy, that rely far harder on full CGI. And because the technology had grown in power, as had confidence in the technology, Peter Jackson was willing to run these kinds of shots for much longer without worrying that the audience will recognize it as computerized trickery. Although massive is implemented very occasionally in The Fellowship of the Ring, the only time it is used for a battle sequence is during this prologue, which means this shot of the Last Alliance marching towards Mount Doom is the first ever shot featuring the massive software. There are countless examples of Peter Jackson blending digital and practical effects in these movies, but one example I want to highlight here is how he uses these two extremely brief close-ups of the orcs before we see the battle. This sounds so minor as to not be worth mentioning, but it is very deliberate and very effective. We do not get similar shots for the human characters, because we know what humans are. We see an army of dudes in armor holding swords, and we intuitively understand what that means. When we see a horde of something that we can't quite tell what it is, we are less able to react emotionally to what is going on. Peter Jackson notably did not do this in the Battle of the Five Armies, as we have a horde of CGI soldiers led by Billy Connolly versus a horde of CGI soldiers led by Lee Pace versus a horde of CGI soldiers led by a CGI Crixus the Undefeated Gaul. This means the armies themselves are not personable. They are not recognized as a collective consisting of individuals. They are simply a mass of digitally created pixels acting as one, which means the audience is going to be less invested in what is going on. We do get a couple of close-ups of dwarves played by real people during the battle, but aside from them, all three armies are depicted as lacking any kind of individuality. The absence of these close-ups means the armies do not feel real. Conversely, even though Peter Jackson was fucking strapped for time in The Fellowship of the Ring, he understood the importance of showing what the orcs are before we see thousands of them mashing themselves into the elves, particularly because this is the first time the audience has seen an orc.
The feeling we wanted to get with Sauron's helmet was the feeling of a corpse, of the rotting face of a horse corpse, with those long bony structures coming out of those deep-set socketed eyes, those great big nostrils for sucking in and blowing out a lot of air. The intaglio was put on as a photographic process that then was acid etched using sulfuric and hydrochloric acid to eat the surface of the metal to give the appearance that the surface of the steel is crawling with this wicked ivory all over it.
Sauron is crucial to these films because his will is what sets everything in motion, but the only time he actually shows up on screen is during this prologue, aside from a brief sequence inside a palantir during an extended Return of the King scene. Sauron has less than 90 seconds of screen time here, and he needed to make one hell of an entrance and one hell of an exit. And because he never speaks, and because much of his screen time is focused on the ring, not him, this needed to be accomplished almost entirely through his character design. The production team managed to create something absolutely iconic without crossing the line into caricature. On paper, Sauron could have easily turned into a Saturday morning cartoon villain, or a Dr. Evil-style parody of himself. An edgy sorcerer dressed all in black wearing an evil cape who lives in an evil volcano and is hell-bent on taking over the world. Deciding to base his helmet on a horse skull is an interesting move that immediately dehumanizes Sauron and implies that whatever is underneath that helmet is too horrifying to comprehend. Sauron doesn't have any particular connection to horses, but horse skulls look spooky as all hell, and the men of Middle-earth frequently use horses, so this could be seen as a perversion of something that is integral to one culture of the Free Peoples. There are multiple suggestions that he is simply a personification of evil that is barely contained within the armor. He is described in the narration only as the Dark Lord Sauron, and we can see that he is about 10 feet tall. But aside from this, we get no clue as to what Sauron actually is. The books portray Sauron as a Maiar. He is essentially a fallen angel, but the film doesn't really have the time or ability to explain this to the audience, which is why the filmmakers decided to remain ambiguous. He could be a wizard, he could be an elf, or even a man who became incredibly powerful through the use of dark magic. His armor is corroded, which gives it this ornate quality where it is covered in intricate patterns, but also suggests that the metal is melting or disintegrating as a result of whatever is inside of it. His finger literally turns into dust when it is cut from his hand, and he of course explodes when the ring is separated from him, which implies that this creature was held together by the power of the ring itself. The result is that Sauron doesn't really come across like someone who is trying really hard to look evil. He instead looks like what evil itself would look like if it threw on some clothes, picked up a weapon, and marched into battle. The other visual component I want to mention here is Gollum. Gollum is seen very sparingly, and this is partly for narrative reasons, but also because his design and the technology required to create him were not ready for the Fellowship of the Ring. If this video series continues and I make it to the Two Towers, I will cover some of the technological developments that went into making Gollum as we see him later in the trilogy, but for now, he barely shows up at all, and he is always confined to the shadows. This meant the filmmakers could include him in the Fellowship of the Ring without using technology that wasn't ready yet, and although Gollum's design does change slightly in between movies, he is obscured enough in the Fellowship of the Ring to where it is very difficult to notice. This avoids the Yoda problem, where Yoda changes from a puppet to a CGI creature as a result of George Lucas believing that the puppet looked dated, and likely believing that he could do a better job using computers, as he had done with the infernal creation known as Jar Jar Binks. Anyway, whilst Andy Serkis is credited as the voice of Gollum, he did not provide any motion capture for this film. And what we do see of Gollum was animated entirely without using motion capture data. This shot of Gollum in the cave is entirely real. The set is real, the water is real, and the lighting is real. The only thing that is digital is Gollum himself. Although we don't get a good look at him, small details such as his hair and eyes catching in the light help to make this creature convincing, which is aided by the fact that although he is center frame and very much the focus of the shot, he barely moves and the shot is extremely dark.
The music score on any film is obviously vitally important because it totally guides your emotions. It's doing two jobs at the same time, and one, it's underscoring the film, it's providing an emotional bridge between the movie and the audience, and it's drawing the audience in. But it's doing it in such a way that it's also telling you a lot about the cultures.
Howard Shore's music for The Lord of the Rings is, in my view, the best musical score ever written because it is a masterclass in using leitmotifs to enhance the story being told. A leitmotif is essentially a recurring musical theme, and these can be used for a variety of purposes, but Howard Shore uses them primarily to help the audience identify characters, locations, themes, and moods. Howard Shore intended for there to be 3 versions of The Lord of the Rings: the book, the films, and the music. It took him nearly 4 years to write the whole thing. He had been working on the score for 2 years by the time The Fellowship of the Ring was released, when the normal time window for film composition is 6 to 8 weeks. This resulted in an intricately interwoven tapestry of themes that change subtly throughout 11 hours of music that seamlessly integrates Tolkien's many languages into the score, including Sindarin, Quenya, Kuzdul, Old English, Adonaic, and the Black Speech. As a point of comparison, there are about 15 to 20 leitmotifs in the original Star Wars trilogy, depending on who you ask. Howard Shore's score for the Lord of the Rings trilogy contains more than 90. If you don't know any music theory, that's absolutely fine. I am definitely not an expert on music theory myself, but I understand enough as to hopefully be able to explain some of this without getting technical, and the goal here is to unpack how and why the various leitmotifs are used in a manner that can be understood by people with no interest in music theory. Because the score is essentially the story being told entirely through music, and it is only when we combine the music with the visual components, as well as the script, that we get the full experience. The The first piece of music we hear is one of the most mysterious sounding musical themes in the film, that of Lothlorien. It was written to be emotionally agnostic, neither happy nor sad, aggressive nor passive, and the reason this theme opens the film is that it establishes a connection to the elves, specifically Galadriel, who provides the narration, and the theme shows up again later in the film when we meet her. This also contextualizes the prologue as the time of the elves, and this theme reoccurs in multiple forms later in the trilogy. In between the Lothlorien theme and the History of the Ring theme, we also hear the faintest hint of the Fellowship theme for the first time. This is extremely basic and is simply 3 chords with nothing layered over the top, giving us the approximate shape of something that is little more than a whisper. The History of the Ring theme is arguably the main theme for The Lord of the Rings, and it is primarily used to show how the ring has travelled from person to person, bringing with it unbearable sadness and tragedy. We first hear it when the title card for The Lord of the Rings appears on screen, and it continues as the rings are distributed. It plays again when Isildur takes the ring, when Isildur is betrayed by the ring, and a 4th time when Bilbo takes the ring. This means the motif for the History of the Ring is firmly established in the opening minutes of the film, which is appropriate given how important the ring is, and it lays the groundwork for development in the later films when the theme changes during some of the most pivotal moments in the trilogy. The first time this happens, and we get a sense of what Howard Shore might describe as tragic inevitability, but what I shall describe as, oh fucking god, no, is when Isildur first holds the ring after defeating Sauron. This should be triumphant, but the melancholic theme for the ring plays, and immediately we know, okay, well, this man has already lost. The History of the Ring theme bookends the prologue, as we hear it when the title card appears and the story of the ring begins, and it plays again at the end after Bilbo takes the ring. This firmly contextualizes the prologue as the story of the ring, and this musical theme is immediately associated with its corrupting power. The descending third is the first of 3 Mordor themes we are introduced to, and this one signifies impending doom. Appropriately, it plays when the last alliance marches into battle. Most Mordor-related music is built on this musical theme, and the other 2 are introduced later and layered over the top. This theme is also used frequently to represent Isengard as well as Mordor, which symbolizes the alliance Sauron has with Saruman. During the battle, we hear the Ringwraiths theme, and I don't want to go into this one really because the Ringwraiths do not appear in the prologue, so I'll save discussions about the theme itself until the Nazgul are introduced. But it is notable that the first time we hear this musical theme is when Sauron's forces are first seen, and it plays again when Sauron shows up and unleashes his formidable power. The Footsteps of Doom theme is essentially a variation of the Ringwraiths theme. It has the same rhythmic pattern, but it lacks the choir, and it symbolizes the threat of Sauron and the ring, whilst the Ringwraiths theme symbolizes his evil being unleashed. The Fall of Man theme, of course, symbolizes the weakness of men. It is introduced during the prologue when Elendil is killed, which is the event that led to Isildur being ensnared by the ring, and the Fall of Men theme is used much later in the film when Boromir attempts to take the ring from Frodo. Most of the musical development for Gollum appropriately takes place in The Two Towers and The Return of the King because although Gollum appears in the Fellowship of the Ring, we do not yet understand who Gollum is, and the battle between his personalities is not yet a part of the story. However, the prologue introduces the Pity of Gollum theme as a baseline before this theme is developed in later movies and interwoven with other themes such as those of The Ring and Mordor. The pity of Gollum is built around a 4-note pattern that Howard Shore refers to as weakness and redemption, and this musical idea shows up elsewhere, such as in the Rivendell theme and the Lighting the Beacons sequence. Weakness and redemption are a key thematic component of The Lord of the Rings, and so this 4-note pattern shows up frequently. The prologue doesn't give us a huge amount of character work because it is primarily focused on the journey of the ring, but there are some details worth mentioning. Galadriel serves as the narrator, and so we can assume that she is mostly reliable, although this may not be entirely true. When we first watch this prologue, we don't know that the lovely voice of Cate Blanchett is Galadriel, because we don't know who Galadriel is. We don't even know what elves are, because we are starting with a blank slate. This means her disembodied voice could just be the narrator, or she could be some other character we simply don't know. It is only after the Fellowship arrives in Lothlorien that we know for sure that Galadriel was giving us the narration at the start of the film. Prior to the additional context that Galadriel, an elf, was giving the narration can be assumed to be reliable. We have no suggestion of any bias because these words are simply words being delivered by someone who appears to know all about the history of Middle-earth, and we have no real understanding as to her personality. This means when she says multiple times that men are weak and easy to corrupt, we understand that men are weak and easy to corrupt. That is simply true of men in this fantasy setting. It is only later when we realize, okay, this was Galadriel and she is an elf, that given everything that happened as a result of the weakness and corruptibility of men, it is only natural that her perspective is that men are weak and easy to corrupt. Elrond, in fact, has exactly the same perspective, but this is not necessarily true of all men, which is explored in Aragorn's story. This means that the prologue, as it is presented to the viewer, suggests that all hope is lost. The world is fucked. I feel it in the water, I feel it in the earth. Men suck and they ruined everything. But later in the film, it becomes clear that whilst this information is accurate, Galadriel's assessment of the fallibility of men is not objectively true. And this plays into the idea that there is a glimmer of hope.
The other thing that was really hard about the prologue was from what point of view do you tell this story? In past attempts, we'd told it through the point of view of Isildur solely, or we'd tried to tell it from a kind of God's eye point of view. We tried all these different points of view, but in the end, it wasn't until we came to understand that the ring is in fact a protagonist in this story. In many ways, it's an antagonist, and that what we should do is tell the prologue from the ring's point of view.
The writers originally intended for the prologue to be narrated by the narrator, a character who does not appear elsewhere, and he would simply be treated as an unnamed omniscient voice, and so would essentially be the writers talking directly to the audience. They then decided to have Frodo give the voiceover, but this was removed because although The Lord of the Rings is about Frodo, this prologue happened thousands of years before Frodo was born, and it does not form a part of his story. Additionally, had Frodo given the voiceover retrospectively, this would have removed a large amount of tension from the film because we would know that Frodo survives. Gandalf was then considered, which makes an amount of sense. Gandalf is presented throughout the film as the most knowledgeable character. We know he has good intentions and is trustworthy, and he frequently gives exposition to the hobbits elsewhere, but the filmmakers ended up going for Galadriel because the elves were very much present for and directly involved in these events, whilst Gandalf was not.
There was one point when Gandalf's voice was going to be telling the story, and I made a plea for that. I think I was told, Ian, you've got enough to do in this movie without doing the prologue as well, but I'm not sure when you watch it whether you could guess that this was Galadriel, or you might recognise that it was Cate Blanchett, which is not at this point quite the same thing.
Aside from Galadriel, we get minimal characterization. Isildur is shown to be weak and easy to corrupt, despite having been shown to be a brave warrior fighting against evil, and this plays into Aragorn's character arc as we are not simply told that Isildur was weak, we literally see a strong man give in to the seduction of the ring and the power it promised. Elrond is also seen in the prologue, although we don't know that he is Elrond at this point, and it is only later when we get the flashback with Elrond and Isildur that we understand their relationship, and the relationship elves have with men ever since that one time when Isildur doomed them all. Sauron doesn't have much in the way of a personality, he is just evil and wants to take over the world. He is presented as an absolute evil, and in the films at least, he is functionally Satan himself. One thing worth mentioning is that Sauron is only defeated because he reaches his ring hand towards Isildur, and this gives Isildur the opportunity to chop his finger off. This can be hand-waved because these are events being relayed to us by Galadriel, who was not present. These events took place 3,000 years ago, and only Sauron and Isildur themselves would know exactly how this went down. In the books, Gil-galad was burned to death by the heat of Sauron's hand, so it is possible that in one version of the script, Sauron would have reached down and killed Gil-galad by throttling him with flaming hot fire fists, and here he was intending to do the same to Isildur. It is also entirely possible that Peter Jackson needed a way for Isildur to plausibly be able to cut the ring from Sauron's finger, and given that he had dialed up Sauron's size to make him more imposing, one way to do this is to have Sauron reach down towards Isildur. My explanation is that I chalk this down to overconfidence. He wanted to kill Isildur with his bare hands, and he believed Isildur was not a threat because he had just broken his sword. We also get some brief characterization for Gollum. We see that he talks to himself and the ring, and this forms the basis for his obsession. Although Gollum does not play a major role in the Fellowship of the Ring, it is critical to the story that Gollum follows the Fellowship as they journey through Moria and onwards. If we never see Gollum with the ring, then we would simply be told, yeah, Gollum had it before and he went a bit nuts, that's why he's following us. But this brief scene shows Gollum's obsession, paranoia, and extreme distress when the ring is lost. That's just about everything I have to say about the Last Alliance prologue. This was a critical sequence to get right to set up the rest of the film, and I think the filmmakers could not have done a better job. This is an incredibly strong opening that sets up countless parts of the story and serves as an excellent introduction to the world of Middle-earth. Before I wrap up, however, I would like to talk briefly about future videos. I have been wanting to make videos like this on The Lord of the Rings for a while now, but I was trying to work out the best way to do it. Unfortunately, because of how YouTube's automated copyright system works, or more accurately, doesn't, it is simply not possible to reliably make long videos that use a large amount of footage from one copyrighted source, which I think would be necessary if I were to make many hour-long videos covering one film. Oftentimes, this is not a problem, but given the detail with which I would like to talk about The Lord of the Rings, I don't consider it possible to make a video many hours in length without having to make the video worse so as to avoid it getting taken down. I really despise the idea of B-roll, so if I am forced to reduce the amount of footage from one particular copyrighted source in a video, then I try my best to use relevant footage from other movies. So if I am talking about a battle scene, then I will use footage from a battle scene in another movie. But this is still not ideal, because it means what I am showing you and what I am talking about are not the same thing. Making slightly shorter videos like this one means that I am, theoretically, able to use more footage from the film in question, which I think is crucial to making these videos the best that they can be. If I continue with this series, I have decided that, unless I am left with no choice, I will be using footage from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the Hobbit trilogy, the Ralph Bakshi animated Lord of the Rings film, and the Rankin Bass Hobbit and Return of the King animated films. And I will be combining these with behind-the-scenes footage where relevant, as well as Lord of the Rings related video games if I need additional footage in a particular location or focusing on a particular event. This will hopefully allow me to keep the visuals tightly focused on The Lord of the Rings without having to battle against YouTube's overzealous copyright bots. I have also decided that I will not be using any footage from Rings of Power, because although it may be relevant if I am discussing a character or location that appears in Rings of Power, the simple fact is that for the vast majority of people, myself included, Rings of Power evokes a totally different emotional response to the more respectful adaptations of Tolkien's work, and I figure the videos would be better served having a still image from The Lord of the Rings up for 10 seconds than showing 10 seconds of footage from a cinematic abortion that happens to have The Lord of the Rings in its title. Anyway, if you guys did enjoy the video and you want me to continue the series, please like, share, and subscribe, as this will help the channel. I would like to make quite a lot of videos on The Lord of the Rings, and if I cover basically every scene, then this process will take me years. But as the videos will be shorter than some of my others, this is the kind of thing I can work on in between larger projects. Because I have already discussed the changes between the theatrical and extended editions at length, I will do my best not to repeat myself, and for the purposes of these videos, I'm currently intending to focus on the extended editions. The structure of these videos will change depending on the scene I am discussing. For example, I barely spoke about character writing here, but in later scenes this will probably encompass most of the video. And because I would like to be making these videos gradually over the course of many months and years, if you have any suggestions as to how I could improve this format going forwards, please let me know in the comments. In the video description, you will find links to the second channel where I upload various extra bits including music, tier lists, and video game streams, and you will also find links to my Discord server and my Patreon. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.